Quick, name an African American NHL player. It's okay if you didn't say JT Brown or Dustin Bufflin. Unless you are a die-hard fan of the NHL, you probably can't name many African American players. And if you said PK Subban, he's from Toronto. So why is it that a North American sports league, which has been around for nearly 100 years, has fewer than 5 African Americans and less than 30 total players of African descent currently playing? It might not be about culture, but more about numbers. Let's take a look. Before I get into this, I want to ask him cash. Canadian hockey player Willie O'Ree broke the color barrier in the NHL in 1958, nearly 10 years after Jackie Robinson had historically integrated baseball. O'Ree did encounter overt racism, but stated that Canadian cities such as Montreal and Toronto seemed to have much less. What's interesting about O'Ree and his monumental breakthrough isn't just the fact he had to heroically overcome racism, but also the fact that the NHL was nearly a decade behind all leagues when it comes to integration. The NFL integrated in 1948, and the NBA, which I could imagine was the most boring league ever prior, integrated in 1950. In each other sport, there was obvious segregation that needed to be overcome. The NBA had the Black Fives, the MLB the Negro Leagues, and the NFL had plenty of black players who wanted to play football. And that brings us back to hockey, where at the time of Willie O'Ree's breakthrough, there weren't a ton of squads of black players like in other sports. But there were indeed pioneers bringing the game to all kinds, and their accomplishments should not be diminished. The NHL actually has a wonderful documentary on the subject, and let's be clear here, racism is present today, and it was plenty turned up in the 40s and 50s. Once O'Ree did not return to the NHL in 1962, no black players would get on the sheet for 13 more years, when Canadian Mike Marson was drafted in 1974. It wouldn't be until 1978 that an African American, Val James, would be the first to make it into the league for the Buffalo Sabres. The number of players of African descent varied in sparse numbers throughout the 80s and 90s, with Grant Fuhr likely being the most known player as he won cup after cup alongside Wayne Gretzky. By the mid-2010s, though, more black players had come into the league, with 23 active NHLers being of African descent. Today, you could conceivably have an entire NHL roster with backups comprising only black players, which is amazing progress for a league that percentage-wise truly does make players of color a minority. Before we examine the theoretical root cause of this, let's look at how the NHL statistically compares to other leagues in terms of ethnic diversity. In 2010, 66% of NFL players were African American, 9% of MLB players were African American, and in the NBA, an astounding 78% of athletes are black. Enter in hockey, where out of 713 active roster spots, only around 30 are of African descent, a percentage of 4. If you were to limit that to just African American, the percentage drops to 0.07. Those are paltry numbers for a country that has over 37 million African American residents. So if you look at a country like Sweden, which only has a total population of 9.9 million, about 90 Swedes took the NHL ice last year, representing 8% of the entire league. And even more astounding, Johnny Oduya is from Sweden. So demographically and percentage-wise, Sweden has just as many black players in the NHL than does America. Mind-blowing. So let's get to the real question. Is the NHL racist? Would Donald Sterling buy a franchise if he could? Through data, we find that the answer is a resounding no. Starting off, Americans only represent about 1/3 of the league to begin with, and the states these players come from include Minnesota with 46 active players, Michigan with 32, New York with 30, Massachusetts with 23, and most all of the top states being in the Northeast. Not many players hail from the Southeast period, where 11 players were born. Now let's look at population density and distribution in the US. Clearly you can see where the majority of African Americans live, and none of these states are known as hockey states. Physical geography aside, the next big factor is accessibility to being able to play the sport. Hockey has requirements beyond that of the other 3 major North American sports. You need skates, you need equipment, and most importantly, you need ice. And ice in any non-cold weather state has to be made artificially, which is expensive. And that limits access to anyone, regardless of racial breakdown, in a warm weather state playing hockey. There's a reason why Thailand's national team got beat 93-0 in an international contest. No ice, no players. In Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even upstate New York, ice is abundant as those states are colder than Ted Williams' frozen head. Hockey is played year-round and they have the most ice rinks per capita of any state, with one for every 25,000 people. In the Southeast, there is less than one rink per 500,000 to 1 million people in every state, with ironically Florida having the most with a scant 21. Sorry, but this isn't a race problem, it's simple distance. The final factor is culturally, African Americans generally favor the other North American sports to become fans of over hockey. Less than 3% of hockey fans in America are African American, though these numbers are growing as teams make their way into the Southeast. But you still see no teams in the areas most densely populated by African Americans. They tried with the Atlanta Thrashers, but they folded up shop after 12 years. And it wasn't just because they were poorly attended, they were just bad. The one thing that can be brought out of this is that hockey is making progress, albeit slow, towards more ethnic diversity in the sport. As more young African Americans begin to identify with players on the ice and start to love the sport, the numbers will grow. As the NHL looks to add more outreach and expands further into the Southeast, you will see more African American players. It's definitely not something that will happen overnight though, as anyone knows. When it comes to racial progress, sometimes the process is slow, but it's a movement worth pushing for. Could you imagine LeBron James or Steph Curry on the ice? What if Julio Jones was between the pipes? This is a game for all people. Come on everyone, let's do that hockey. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to follow my link below and become an Airbnb host. And leave a like, comment, or subscribe and hit that notification bell if you do. I'm 5 Points Vids, and you made it to the end of this video.